The UCC buyer and seller remedies are easy. Remember, when a breach occurs under the UCC, you can't just sue. You have to go to the buyer and seller's remedies first. Then you have to demand, if you have some reasonable grounds for insecurity, what do? You demand adequate assurances, wait 30 days, and then sue. But first, we go to the remedies. Okay, let's quickly talk about the buyer's and the seller's rights. The buyer has the right to inspect the goods prior to payment because the seller has to pay for the goods when they're delivered. The buyer has the right to inspect the goods. Okay, the buyer may revoke their acceptance if they subsequently discover a nonconformity that does what? Substantially impairs the value of the goods to who? The buyer, and it can't be cured. Okay, so the buyer has the right to inspect the goods. The buyer may also revoke acceptance if they discover what? A nonconformity which what does what? Substantially impairs the value of the goods to the buyer, and it can't be what? Cured. Okay, can you just wait a year? No. Remember, under the UCC, it's always a reasonable time. So you have a reasonable time to revoke acceptance. And do you have to notify the seller that you revoked acceptance? Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Do you have to mitigate? Yes, you do. Okay, contrast to the seller's right to cure. The seller has the right to cure a defective performance when? During the time allowed for performance. That seems a little harsh, doesn't it? The seller has a right to cure. They have to notify the buyer, and of course, they have to cure the defect. Okay, the seller has a right to cure during when? The time allowed for performance. Okay, the seller can request an extension, but the buyer doesn't have to give it. The seller has a right to cure when? During the time allowed to performance. They must notify the buyer and, of course, cure the defect, and they may request an extension. Okay, let's talk about buyer's remedies. The buyer gets market damages, difference between market price and contract price at the time the buyer learned of the breach. Cover damages, if the buyer covers, they get the difference between the contract price and the cover price. That's right. Okay, buyers get breach of warranty damages, the difference between the goods as warranted and the goods as is. Okay, one little wrinkle here. Did the buyer prepay for any of those goods? Then they're entitled to a refund. If the buyer prepaid, they get a refund. If the buyer didn't prepay, they get market damages, cover damages, and breach of warranty damages. Okay, buyer, right to inspect, can revoke their acceptance. If they prepaid, they get a right to a refund, and if not, we resort to the remedies: market damages, cover damages, and breach of warranty damages. Buyers get incidental damages and consequential damages, don't they? Right? So incidental damages are, of course, the expenses you get when the expenses sustained in an attempt to mitigate damages. The expenses, the incidental damages, are just the expenses that you sustained in an attempt to mitigate damages. Buyers and buyers only get consequential damages. Consequential damages just result from the ordinary course of events that flow from the breach. Consequential damages result from the ordinary course of events that flow from the breach. Consequential damages result from the breach. from the ordinary course of events that flow from the breach. That's from the UCC. That's what you need to memorize. Consequential damages result in the ordinary course of events that flow from the breach. And they are only awarded to the extent that they are what? Oh, yes, foreseeable. One way to think about consequential damages are that they're the damages that probably would have resulted from the breach. Look to the facts. Would these damages probably resulted from the breach of the seller's breach? Okay, then they're in the ordinary course of events that flow from the breach, and they have to be awarded to the extent that they are foreseeable. Foreseeable, ordinary course of events that flow from the breach. Okay, so let's run to the seller's remedies. Okay, now we know the seller got that right to cure. Now let's talk about their damages. Market damages. Market price, difference between market price and contract price at time of, that's right, delivery. Resale damages, the difference between the contract price and the resale price. And of course, our lost volume seller gets the lost profits. And do sellers get incidental damages? Yes, sellers get incidental damages. And what are they? Damages sustained in an effort to mitigate. Remember, you're required to mitigate. Okay, one more thing. The seller's action for the price. Seller's action for the price. The seller can bring an action for the price if the goods were lost or damaged after the risk of loss passed to the buyer. Remember, it's FOB wherever. The seller may bring an action for the price if the goods were lost or damaged after the risk of loss passed to the buyer. 2, after the buyer accepts. If the buyer unequivocally accepts and refuses to pay, of course, the seller can bring an action for the price. There's one more circumstance in which a seller can bring an action for the price. When the seller can't resell despite their reasonable attempts to do so. Okay, so seller damages are easy. Let's just remember our seller's action for the price. The seller may bring an action for the price under 3 circumstances. 1, goods lost or damaged after the risk of loss passed to the buyer. 2, the buyer accepted the goods. Or 3, the seller can't resell despite reasonable attempts to do so. And those are our UCC buyer and seller remedies.